Okay, we want to start using Google Spreadsheets in this video and see how we can use Google Spreadsheets to import existing data, do something with the data, create a pivot table on that data, and also based on that pivot table create a chart. So that's basically a walk through a couple of steps that are relevant for your case study work anyway. But before we do that, I want to give you a quick overview of Google Spreadsheets. I think if you have worked with Excel before, this should not be too unfamiliar to you because it's similar, but a little, I would say, a little less functionality, a little cleaner than Excel. So first of all, Google Spreadsheet, as you know, runs in the cloud, so you do not install anything. Everything that you do here is in the browser. And so this also means that it might be a little limited, because when you have something only in a browser, you can, for example, not access the file system from there unless you have an upload window. But if you work with Google Drive, and that's the cloud storage from Google, and then you can access, of course, anything from Google Drive, and that's the idea behind Google Spreadsheets. But nevertheless, if you have information somewhere else stored on your computer, you can always upload that data and work with it in Google Spreadsheets. Okay, so I think the basic layout of Google Spreadsheets is quite familiar. It looks very, very similar to Excel. So you have columns and rows, and the columns are labeled by letters, and the rows are numbered from 1 to however many rows you have, and you can simply just type something into those cells. I think that's something that we don't need to go into detail. But as in Excel, if you type an equal sign, you will see that it's going into a different mode. So for example, if I start typing and you put the equal sign in front of your cell or whatever you're typing, it's assuming you're typing a formula. And I think formulas you are familiar with from Excel are a very important aspect of any spreadsheet calculation, because formulas allow you to actually perform calculations with the data, to aggregate data, to filter data, and do a lot of things with data. But I could also just type in numbers and letters, of course. Okay, so in a second we will import data. We don't want to type it manually here, but we could. But a good way, if you have existing data, is simply importing it and then doing something with it. Another good way is collecting it from Google Forms, as we just did. So then it would also be already here, and we could start working with it. So the bar you see here, you can actually hide it using this little arrow. You hide the menu. Not the bar, but you get more space to work if you prefer that. And in this, I would say, symbol shortcut bar, you get the most important formatting functions for Google Spreadsheets. And I think most of them are fairly self-explanatory. Here you can set different data formats, as you might know also from Excel. So you could, for example, say that a certain cell is a number instead of text. It's by default set to automatic, so it will try to infer which data type you have typed in, but you can also specifically set it here. And we will also use that feature in a second. You can set fonts to whatever you like. You can set the font size, emphasize the text. You can set the text color, of course, background color. You can create frames around your cells and stuff like that. You can align the cells, vertical align. You can say what should happen if the text is longer than the cell. Should it be wrapped or should it be hidden? And a lot more. So that's basically all the formatting, and then up here you have different menu items which we don't go into detail right now. We will use them when we need them. And now I want to show you how we can import data into spreadsheets. So why would we import data? Well, because we have existing data from somewhere else, and in this case we want to showcase importing data from our Hasta Campus Beer shop. And in Hasta Campus Beer shop, this is a shop that we host in Shopify. Shopify is a cloud service that allows us to quickly set up a web shop, and it does all the information management that has to do with the web shop for us. So if a customer buys something, it stores the transaction and the customer's master data for us, and we can later export that data if we want to do something with it. And I did that. I exported the transaction history from our first sale event, but not the personal data, so we don't see any names. It's only the transactions, what was the payment method, what was the amount, the order number, and we will see that in a second. But you can export that from the shop, and I have done that, and I will try to import that now. So importing data, you can do that under File, and then, as you would expect, there is an import menu item. And if you click that, you get a dialog which allows you to specify the source of your data. So that this could be your drive, your own Google Drive, where you already have the data. Or you could say, okay, I want to upload that data. It's on my computer. And I will do that. And then I click on Select from my device, and I have it under Downloads called Transaction Export 1. And I simply click Open. So what's happening now is uploading the file, and then I get a new dialog where it asks me where it should import the new data. So you can specify an import location, and I can say create a new spreadsheet. That would create a new file in Google Drive all along. I don't want to do that. I want to keep this spreadsheet and create a new sheet for my uploaded data. You could also say replace a spreadsheet, replace the current sheet, append to the current sheet, and so forth. But I want to insert a new sheet, which will effectively add another sheet down here. So I have a second one. It has detected that it's a CSV file, so it's a comma-separated values, meaning it's a text file with a certain format. We will learn about comma-separated files later on, but basically it's simply text separated by a certain delimiter. And we can say, okay, what is the delimiter or separator? And we could tell it to detect it automatically. Since it knows what CSV is, it can look for these separators. But if it doesn't recognize it correctly, we could also say directly, okay, it's a comma or it's a semicolon, but let's detect it automatically in this case. And then we can ask or tell Google Spreadsheets to either convert text to numbers, dates, and formulas, so it will try to recognize for each column what the data type is, or we could say, no, leave it as it is, then we will have only strings, only text, depending on what we want. We choose the convert text to numbers, dates, and formulas option. Okay, and then I click on import, and it has created a new sheet down here, and it has given it the file name of the file that I just imported. All right, and then this is what you typically find in a spreadsheet is this kind of layout. And the layout is you have columns, and those columns have a name, typically, and you have rows, and each row is basically one record. And the rows are filled with values for the columns. So this is basically the information or the data that we have just imported in a raw format, but now in a spreadsheet and no longer in a CSV file. We can also see how this original CSV file looked like. I opened it in Visual Studio here. So this is the original file, and as you can see, the values are comma separated. So the first line is the header line for all the different columns, and each line below that is actually a record. So and the values are comma separated. Google Spreadsheet detected that automatically and created this neat spreadsheet with columns and rows. All right, this is what I would call the raw data. I renamed this for our purposes because I want to show you what a good structure of a spreadsheet could look like. And it's always a good idea if you import data and you want to work with it, and by work with it I mean changing it, it's always a good idea to keep the original raw data. And also, if you later upload another version of the data, so for example, you have more transactions because time has passed and you sold more, then you might update this, and then you simply have to replace the raw data tab, and everything else stays intact. So you can simply replace this later on. And everything else that we do with the data now, we do in a different separated spreadsheet. Okay. So what do we want to do with the data? We said we wanted to create a pivot table. And a pivot table is maybe something that you have not worked with yet. May I ask by a show of hands, does anyone know what pivot tables are? Pivot tables are also present in Excel and very popular there. But it's mostly something that few people know. So no one has worked with pivot tables before. Okay, pivot tables are really, really useful if you have that kind of data. And that's the typical kind of data you have, columns and column names and rows, one row per record. So what a pivot table can do for you, and what I do now is I copy the raw data and paste it into another sheet, just so I have a copy and I keep the raw data as it is, so I won't touch the raw data anymore. I can from now on keep working in, I call that the processing data sheet. This is where I can now safely work with the data, and I know that the raw data will stay intact, and I can recover it any time. Of course, I can also upload the file again, but I don't want to do that again. So I just make a copy of that, and I want to create a pivot table based on that data. So what you do when you want to create a pivot table is very simple. You simply select all the data, and by all the data I mean all records. So it should go down until row 179. If you only have it up until row 170, you will be missing information. So when you look at the pivot table, it will be missing those rows. So make sure you have all the rows, and then click on data, and there you find pivot table. So this is one feature that's also present in Google Spreadsheets, because it's very useful and very often used to analyze data. So I click on that, and it asks me, should I create a new sheet or insert it into an existing sheet? I say I want a new sheet for the pivot table, so it creates another tab down here, and the data range was already assumed from the current selection that I made. Otherwise, I could have also selected the range at this point. So now I create it, and I get this new sheet. It's called Pivot Table 2, and I simply call it Pivot Table. I renamed it by double clicking it. So what we see now is an empty pivot table with labels rows, values, and columns, and that's basically what a pivot table is made up of. So we have the option to specify what should be displayed in the rows, what should be displayed in the columns, and what should be the values that we want to display. Well, let's first check, see what are the values that we might want to put in. And here you have the different categories, and if you click add at the values label, you can say, okay, I want the amount to be a value, and then immediately you get by default the sum of all the amounts. You can change that to say, okay, no, I don't want a sum, I want an average. So that would now be the average amount per transaction. But what we actually want in this case is the sum. So I change it back to sum, and now we have a value. So every time we click on the pivot table, which is now a lot smaller, we get this view on the right side here. Now we can add something to our view. What we're building with the pivot table is basically a view consisting of rows and columns, and in the middle we have some value that we look at. So let's say we wanted to see in the rows, we wanted to see the gateway. And the gateway, if you look at the data, is what is the payment method? Is it Shopify payments or is it PayPal? That were the two payment methods that we had. And Shopify payment was basically credit card, Master or Visa. So if I click on that, it will add the payment so the gateway to my view, and it will show me the amounts by gateway in this case. So you see PayPal, we made 5,171 euros with PayPal, and with credit card or Shopify payments, but we only had credit card 3,000 something. And in total, we get this. If we don't want to see the total, we can simply uncheck show totals, and we get this. So this is adding rows, and now what do we want to see in the columns? So you remember from the task that we are trying to do here is we want to see the development of our sales over time. So a good idea would be to see the time in the columns. So that would be nice. So what if I added the created at? That's when the transaction was created. Then we get a problem a little bit, because in created at we have a date and time in this format, and each of those is of course unique. So what a pivot table would do is usually aggregate the data. If, for example, we had a month or days there, it could create a sum per day or a sum per month. In this case, we have timestamps which are unique, so we get one column for each transaction basically, and that's not what we want. That's definitely not what we want. We want to see the development, for example, maybe on a daily or even a weekly basis. Let's say we want a weekly development. So we go back to our processing sheet, and this is the column we're talking about, so created at, which is obviously not useful in this configuration. So what we would like to do is use a formula or a function such as week num. Week num gives us the number of the week from a date, and we would want to apply it to created at. So unfortunately this doesn't seem to work, and that's because it cannot process the date as it is formatted here. So we need to change something, and it's particularly the time zone information that is in the way. So this plus 02 hours. So what we need to do first is we create a field that we call created at formatted. You can name it whatever you like. And we transform our original created at field and cut off the information about the time zone. And for everything there's a formula, and also for cutting off something. So left is a formula that allows us to create a substring starting from the beginning until a certain point of the string. And if you count, it's exactly 19 characters that we want. That would be until here, and then we want to cut off the rest. So we want column or cell E2 from the beginning, 19 characters and nothing more. And the result is we cut off the information about the time zone. And then what we can do is simply double click on this little box here and apply. I don't know, sometimes that works. That's, I think, a bug, but you can also copy it and paste it across your whole data set. And then it's applied to all your rows. So for every row, we now have a timestamp with which we can work. And when I now make this a little bit smaller, so we see actually more to the right, I can add the column that I originally wanted to add and say month. Let's see if this already works. Month from would be the month, but we wanted the week num. So we could also use month, but we will use the week num. And it gives us the number of the week in which this transaction took place. And yeah, so now it works. That's weird. Double clicking should propagate the formula all the way down until there is no more data. So I don't know why it didn't work before, but now you should see that it's neatly until the last record. Okay, and I'll name this week of transaction. Okay, now I've created a new field in my processing data tab. So I did not touch the original data, and that's important. And it's also a good idea to highlight those columns that were not in the original data. And I like to highlight that using a background color, a light green in this case. You can choose, of course, whatever you like. But if you have a light green here, it's clear that this is added later on. It's an addition to the raw data. And now, when I go back to my pivot table, I need to tell the pivot table it should not go until 179, but actually until k. So we include j and k as the new columns. So if I change that and add the k here, hit enter, and then I remove the created add field and instead add the week of transaction, then we get a much better overview. So we see that now the week 21, 22, 23, 24 is where we made, and 25, where we made most of our transactions. And then in week 32, there was another transaction, which I think, if I double click here, it was a refund. So this is another feature. If you double click on a cell in a pivot table, you get a view of the original underlying data records. So this was only one record. You can safely delete this temporary view afterwards. But for example, in this one, there's more than one record, and if you double click, then you get all the original transactions that lie behind this cell. And you get the chance to delete it right away. Okay, so this is more what we want. I don't want any totals. So I only want week 21 through 25. I don't want the 32 because that was an outlier. It was not important to our business. So let's add a filter. So we have added columns, rows, and we have added values. So that's basically our setup for this pivot table. And now we can say, okay, we want to filter based on week of transaction. And then we say, okay, we do not want to include week 32. So then we have a view that we can base our chart on, which is the development over time visually. So now we already see it, but as you all know, numbers are very hard to interpret for our eyes. So when we see the numbers and we look real close, we can infer the weeks when we had a lot of sales, and we can see where there were few, but to really see the differences, it's much easier to visualize it. And that we can do when we click on the pivot table and we say insert chart. It will, in this case, automatically create a suitable visualization because it tries to infer ways how we could visualize the underlying data. And when we are currently inside of a pivot table with our cursor, when we say insert chart, it will assume that we want to create a chart based on the pivot table. And we could say, I don't know, sales transactions over time as a header. And there you already see the visual representation. And then if you wanted a line chart, you could, for example, also change that in setup, and you can change everything you want about the chart. So we could create a line chart out of it. But I think the bar chart was also suitable. So you could then also add the two series for the two payment methods if you wanted. So you can now change the chart and format it and style it, and of course later also export it, for example, to your slide presentation or share it with your team. But this is basically the walkthrough from importing the data, creating new fields that help you better analyze the data. In this case, we simply formatted the date in a manner so that we can extract the week or the month from the date, so that Google Spreadsheets can actually work with it. And then we created a pivot table. We added some relevant fields that we wanted, and then now I must say this is basically just the Shopify payment, so it's not quite the whole transaction development. So if we wanted to see both, we would need to remove the rows here. So the gateway, if you remove that, that's stupid. Okay, I actually wanted to have this as a series. That would be even better. So I click on the chart, and let's add that. So we have series Shopify payments, and then we add the PayPal as well. And then we say Why does it have such a weird head? Oh, I need to include the A column. I hope that's then we have PayPal and Shopify next to each other. So now we have the complete overview. Otherwise, it would be misleading. And of course, we can change the labels. Those are not correct. I would say this is the amount, and this is the weeks, and then the legend is correct. Okay, this would be the final result. So then we have it actually the same information that we have in the pivot table. And yeah, you can also create charts based on the original data, but charts in Google Spreadsheets and in Excel as well, they expect a certain type of, a certain shape of data, which is called the wide form. And there's an item where we'll talk about that, the wide form of data versus the long form. And just to give you a preview, this is the wide form, which is basically better readable for humans, and also spreadsheet charting relies on that kind of data. And this is the long form, and the difference is, well, we will learn about the difference next time. It would be too much to introduce it here. But there is a fundamental difference, and depending on what system we are using, if it's a spreadsheet system where we want to do our visualization, we need usually the wide form. But when we work with tools like Tableau or database systems, they usually work with the long form to do analysis. And it's basically, you can convert one to the other, but you need to know which one you need to choose when you work with certain methods and tools. Okay, so this was, as I said, a quick walkthrough to see from importing data to a chart what steps we need to take. And on the way, we learned about some of the features that spreadsheets offer to us. When you work with data that is collected from Google Forms, it might be a little easier. So usually the data is stored in a format that is already readable by Google Forms. Otherwise, it would be questionable why they store it in that format. But it should be easier to keep working with the data. But the steps with the pivot table and creating the chart, they should be quite similar. And this is what you should try in your case study. Okay, are there any questions regarding this so far? As I said, there's much more that we are going to, or that not we're going to, but which we could look at in the context of spreadsheets. And I will also add more tutorials and videos which are not necessary for your case study, but which you can nevertheless maybe use in other contexts. So the goal is also over the next semesters, I won't add everything this semester, but I try to add more tutorials that give you walkthroughs for common use cases that we tackle with spreadsheets. So this one is a particular one you will use in your case study, but you will probably encounter other ones as well.